we all recognize we need to address problems. But, and I'm sort of a bit like the question earlier, can we do it from within the university system as it is now, by gradual change, by focusing our KPIs further towards problem solving and placements, or do we actually have to shake up the whole system? And I want to maybe ask George first, whether you think the system is broken, or can we fix it from the inside?
I don't know the answer. I do think that, as everyone has said, that the peer review system was set up to deal with a particular problem, which was when the government decided that it had a proper role in supporting research. Scientists correctly said, we do not want the money distributed according to political priorities by politicians. We'd like it distributed by scientists and engineers. Good idea. What unfortunately happens is that as the scientific process becomes more democratic, then a distribution system that was designed to be elitist runs into problems. And what we have now is a system which is very large. We've probably overbred in the United States in terms of scientists and engineers. You find review panels that are of varying degrees of sophistication and expertise, and it's not clear that the results really favor much of what we've been talking about. Whether that can be fixed or not is a really interesting question. I don't know. I mean, there's something to be said for having sunset clauses for many enterprises, and this may be a place where one thinks about that.
Just related to that point, I want to come back to the serendipity thing. From my experience of getting grants, I get the grants that are the more obvious proposals. The less obvious ones are more difficult to get funded because, of course, it's easier to pick holes in a adventurous proposal, right? So it's less likely to get funded. So you think, well, just because you get a grant doesn't mean you have to do the research. So you're kind of condemning yourself to getting grants to do projects to keep the lab running, and then in your spare time doing the interesting science that you can't get funded. And I'm reminded of the guy who discovered graphene, Andre Geim. He said he needed to run 10 projects to get one that worked out. And he used the example of graphene and his levitating frog. You know, he thought that was a project that worked out. But these are things he wanted to do but couldn't get funded. And I just wonder if that's just the way it is, that we need to demonstrate productivity and that we're generating things for society, but that the interesting inquiry-based research is almost like a hobby.
Does anyone want to address that? Is it just a hobby if we want to do the curiosity research?
Well, let's all be honest. That's why most of us were motivated to become academics, because we could actually be paid to do what we wanted and have fun. And I think that the question that's been posed today is we have to be a little bit more constrained in our expectations. We can still address important problems, as we heard, and we can still determine what we think is important. Others will decide whether we get recognized for that. But I do think that if we're going to maintain an academic system of the sort that all of us subscribe to, we do have to allow that freedom of choice to the academic. Long-term support, I think, is something Peter could comment on. I think the German system, in many ways, shows how achievement can be determined with long-term support, with high respect for education, both at school level and university level, and with a system that is heavily engaged, I think, with industry.
Yeah, I think in Germany we are still blessed with quite long-term support, whether you're at a university or run a lab in a Max Planck Institute. I think you are not driven by constantly rushing out for getting the next grant. And whether that has fostered, however, an atmosphere where we have these startup companies, I think that's something that is the big question. And I think that's what we hear all the time, that in Germany we are too conservative and we are not coming up with these new ideas in startup companies. That culture is missing. That's the other side of this. So whether it's really the way forward, I think the question is, the jury is out for that. Yes, we are in a great situation in that respect, but I don't know whether that's the future really. So.
So it's interesting. I mean, my experience, and of course, I've met a lot of students coming from Germany, but let me give you the most recent experience. I was doing a keynote talk in Seattle, and one of the young students I met, actually a master's student from Germany, and, you know, it was interesting talking to him. He was like, this is the problem. So, you know, so very clearly articulated what the problem was and had thought about the fact that if this is what I'm going to solve, and if I don't have a device in my lab that can actually help me do my measurements and prove the hypothesis, I'll go and, you know, get that built. I'll go design it, I'll get that built. So to me, I guess it's what was pretty obvious from this case. We're talking about how do we create metrics that, you know, I mean, if he's sort of spent 6 months building a piece of device that's then going to generate solutions to the problem that he thought about, it's, do we allow those opportunities where students are given that type of creative freedom? Because in doing so, it was clearly, you know, he may have published one less paper, but to me, that should then take into account the fact that this student then spent all of this time developing something very creative that did not exist in the labs. And so that balance between, yes, starting with the point that George made, identified the problem, figured out how to solve it, and went off and got that built. So creating various sort of pathways as part of student experience. And of course, to do that, he had to go out and, you know, talk to different companies. It's not like he sort of did that in isolation in a little corner in the lab. So naturally, that ability to exercise that creative freedom meant that this young person could go out and get all these different types of experiences, which I think, again, you could comment on whether this is something that's encouraged, or did I just see an exception?
I don't think that this was something very German. It was just a great person that you had, obviously, there that went out and was so on his own, on her own to solve problems. I think the danger we have in Germany that you get too complacent if you're not challenged through the system, and if you have permanent funding, I think that's the danger we have. We always envy particularly the US with the culture that they have, and I think that's we see always the better end on the other side. So
How could we be complacent with you as the leading editor in the field?